On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, in a basement room in the Ural city of Yekaterinburg, 7 members of a firing squad executed the last Russian emperor, his wife, his 4 daughters, his son, and 4 of their servants. Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, once the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, died in a room measuring roughly 5 meters by 6, surrounded by his family, with bullets and bayonets, in a building the Bolsheviks had quietly nicknamed the House of Special Purpose. The question that haunted Russia for decades afterward and still hasn't fully released its grip on the historical imagination is not simply how this happened, but why the most powerful dynasty in European history collapsed so completely, so violently, and so fast, and what became of the world it left behind. To understand what happened to the Romanovs after 1917, you have to understand what the Romanovs were before 1917. This was not merely a royal family in the European constitutional sense. The Romanovs were, in the theology of the Russian imperial state, the earthly embodiment of divine authority. The Tsar was not just a king. He was the anointed protector of Orthodox Christianity, the father of his people in a quasi-sacred sense that had been carefully constructed over 3 centuries. When Nicholas II was crowned in 1896 at the Assumption Cathedral inside the Moscow Kremlin, the ceremony lasted hours and drew on rituals that reached back to Byzantium. The weight of that crown was not merely symbolic, it was ideological, and when that ideology began to crack, the crack ran all the way through the foundation. The February Revolution of 1917 did not come out of nowhere. Russia had been bleeding for 3 years in the First World War, a conflict that consumed men and resources on a scale that the imperial administration simply could not manage. By early 1917, Petrograd, the renamed, more Russian-sounding version of the German-sounding St. Petersburg, was running short of bread. Not because there was no grain in Russia, but because the railway system, already strained by war logistics, had broken down so severely that food could not reach the capital in sufficient quantities. Hungry workers went on strike. Soldiers sent to suppress them refused to fire. Within days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was over. Nicholas signed his abdication on March 2nd, 1917 at Pskov aboard a train. Think about that for a moment. The last autocrat of all the Russias signed away his empire in a railway carriage at a provincial station, almost alone. He initially abdicated in favor of his son, the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei, then changed his mind and abdicated in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. Mikhail, sensibly terrified, declined the throne the following day. The dynasty was not overthrown in a single dramatic confrontation. It dissolved quietly on a train platform in the rain. What came next for Nicholas and his family was a period of strange, suspended limbo that historians sometimes underestimate. The provisional government, led initially by Prince Georgy Lvov and then by Alexander Kerensky, placed the former Tsar and his family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Zarskoye Selo, the village of the Tsars, about 25 kilometers south of Petrograd. This was not a dungeon. The family had their servants, their routine, their garden. Nicholas chopped wood, the children put on plays. Alexandra, his German-born wife, prayed constantly. To read the family's diaries from this period is to encounter something almost unbearable, a kind of willful normalcy, a refusal to fully absorb what had happened. Nicholas's diary entries from the spring and summer of 1917 record the weather, his walks, his reading, with the same calm detachment he had always maintained. But the world outside those palace gates was transforming at a velocity that made calm detachment a form of delusion. The provisional government faced an immediate and paralyzing dilemma regarding the Romanovs. What do you do with a deposed absolute monarch? Britain's King George V, Nicholas's cousin, initially offered asylum, but then withdrew the offer, fearing the political consequences at home of sheltering an autocrat while British workers were dying in the trenches. This decision, quiet, bureaucratic, almost cowardly, sealed the fate of the Romanovs more than any Bolshevik decree. With Britain unavailable, other European options were either unwilling or inaccessible. The family stayed in Russia, and Russia was running out of time. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. The October Revolution was not, despite its name, a popular uprising. It was a coup, precise and swift, carried out by Lenin's disciplined party, while the provisional government was paralyzed by indecision. Kerensky fled Petrograd in a car borrowed from the American embassy. The Bolsheviks occupied the Winter Palace with relatively little resistance. And suddenly, the Romanovs were no longer prisoners of a shaky liberal government. They were prisoners of a revolutionary party that regarded them as class enemies, symbols of everything that had to be destroyed for the new world to be born. In August 1917, before the Bolshevik takeover, Kerensky had already moved the family east to Tobolsk in western Siberia. The official reason was safety. Petrograd was becoming dangerously unstable. The real reason was also safety, but of a different kind. Kerensky wanted the family out of reach of both the radical left and any potential monarchist rescue attempt. Tobolsk was remote. The family lived in the former governor's house, still with a substantial retinue of servants and some degree of comfort. Nicholas read aloud to the family in the evenings. The children continued their lessons, but the Bolshevik takeover changed the political temperature around them immediately. The local commissars grew more hostile. Rations were cut. Officers who had remained loyal to the family were arrested. The net was tightening. By the spring of 1918, the situation had become genuinely dangerous, and not just for the Romanovs. The Bolsheviks were fighting for survival. They had signed the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, surrendering enormous territories to end the war. Civil war was erupting across Russia. The Czech Legion, former prisoners of war who had sided with the Allies, was seizing control of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The White Army, fighting to restore some version of the old order, was advancing. And the Ural Regional Soviet, the Bolshevik committee controlling the Yekaterinburg region, was growing increasingly anxious about the former Tsar sitting in Tobolsk, potentially becoming a rallying point for counter-revolutionary forces. In April 1918, the decision was made to transfer Nicholas and Alexandra, along with their daughter Maria, to Yekaterinburg. The other children, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei, followed in May. The house chosen to hold them was the Ipatiev house, owned by a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev, who was given 2 hours to vacate. The Bolsheviks renamed it the House of Special Purpose. The windows were whitewashed so the family could not look out. Exercise was limited to a small garden. Guards were crude, sometimes deliberately provocative. The comfortable limbo of Tobolsk was gone. This was something different. This felt like preparation. Here is where the historical record becomes both clearer and more contested. The decision to execute the Romanovs was not made in Yekaterinburg alone. The weight of evidence accumulated over decades, and particularly after the Soviet archives became partially accessible in the 1990s, points toward Moscow. Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov, the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, were almost certainly involved in authorizing or at minimum approving the execution. The local Ural Soviet, led by men like Yakov Yurovsky, who served as the final commandant of the house, and Alexander Biloborodov, the regional party chief, pushed hard for immediate action as White Army forces approached the city. Some historians argue the order came entirely from below, driven by local Bolshevik panic. Others argue Moscow gave the green light and then carefully obscured its involvement afterward. The truth is probably that both things are true simultaneously: local urgency and central authorization, each giving the other permission. On the night of July 16th, Yurovsky woke the family and their servants at around midnight, telling them they needed to move to the basement for safety because fighting in the city was intensifying. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was too ill to walk. The family dressed, brought a few small possessions, and went downstairs. They were arranged in the basement room: Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Alexei, the family doctor Eugene Botkin, the cook Ivan Karitonov, the footman Alexei Trupp, and the maid Anna Demidova. Yurovsky read a brief statement. Nicholas barely had time to respond before the shooting began. The execution was chaotic and prolonged. The room was small. The smoke from the guns was suffocating. Several of the daughters survived the initial volley because diamonds sewn into their corsets, a practical form of emergency wealth, deflected bullets. They were killed with bayonets and additional shots. The whole thing took roughly 20 minutes. It was by any measure a massacre. And then the Bolsheviks faced a new problem: what to do with 11 bodies. The disposal of the remains was handled by Yurovsky himself, and it was deliberately designed to prevent any future veneration or recovery. The bodies were taken by truck to a forest area called Ganina Yama, roughly 15 kilometers from Yekaterinburg. The first plan was to throw the bodies into an abandoned mine shaft, but this was deemed insufficient. The bodies were burned with acid and gasoline, and the remains were buried in two separate locations in the forest, with the specific intent that no one would ever find them. For decades, no one did. But here's the thing about secrets in a country that eventually opens its archives. They have a way of surfacing. In 1976, a Soviet filmmaker and amateur historian named Geli Ryabov, working with a local geologist named Alexander Avdonin, used documents that had been quietly preserved, including a memorandum written by Yurovsky himself describing the burial, to locate what they believed was the primary gravesite. They excavated briefly, confirmed the bones were there, and then, alarmed by the political implications, reburied them and said nothing for more than a decade. It was not until 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, that the site was officially excavated. 9 sets of remains were recovered. Forensic analysis, including DNA testing using blood samples from living relatives of the Romanovs, confirmed the identities. Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 servants had been found. But 2 sets of remains were missing: Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria or Anastasia. This gap in the physical record had already fed one of the most extraordinary identity claims in modern history. For decades, a woman known as Anna Anderson had claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Nicholas II, who she insisted had survived the massacre. Her claim was taken seriously by some surviving members of the Romanov family and by large portions of the Western public. She was intelligent. She knew details about the Romanov family life, and she was compelling. She lived until 1984 and was never definitively disproven during her lifetime. But when DNA testing became available in the 1990s, tissue samples preserved from a medical procedure she had undergone were tested. The result was unambiguous. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. She was almost certainly Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had suffered a serious mental breakdown. The Anastasia myth, which had sustained itself for 7 decades, was a fantasy, however psychologically fascinating. The remains of Alexei and one daughter were found in 2007, in a separate burial site a few meters from the main grave. DNA testing confirmed their identities in 2008. The entire family had been accounted for. There were no survivors. The Romanovs had been completely systematically destroyed. But the story does not end in that forest, because the Romanov family was enormous, and Nicholas and his immediate family were only the most visible branch of it. The fate of the extended Romanov dynasty after 1917 is a story of dispersal, death, survival, and extraordinary historical afterlife. In July 1918, almost simultaneously with the Yekaterinburg massacre, several other Romanov relatives were executed by the Bolsheviks at Alapayevsk, a small town about 140 kilometers northeast of Yekaterinburg. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, Alexandra's older sister, a deeply religious woman who had become a nun after her husband was assassinated in 1905, was thrown alive into an abandoned mine shaft along with several other Romanov relatives. Rescuers who later retrieved the bodies reported that some of the victims had survived the fall and died slowly from their injuries. The Bolsheviks were not merely executing a dynasty, they were exterminating it. In Petrograd, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, Nicholas's uncle, was arrested and shot in January 1919. Grand Dukes Nikolai Mikhailovich, George Mikhailovich, and Dmitry Konstantinovich were also shot in January 1919 in the Peter and Paul Fortress, the same fortress where generations of Romanov czars were buried. The symbolism was either deliberate or unconsciously perfect. The dynasty was being killed in its own sacred ground. Yet not all the Romanovs died. Roughly 40 members of the extended family managed to escape Russia, most of them through the Crimea in 1919, when a British naval squadron evacuated them from the port of Yalta as the Red Army advanced. Among those who escaped were the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, Nicholas's mother, who refused until her death in 1928 to believe that her son had been killed. She lived in Denmark in a kind of dignified exile, maintaining the fiction that Nicholas was alive somewhere, perhaps in hiding. Whether this was genuine psychological denial or a form of protective self-delusion is impossible to know, but it is one of the most poignant details of the entire story. The Romanovs in exile formed a strange, fractured community scattered across Paris, London, Copenhagen, and eventually New York. Some adapted, some did not. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, Nicholas's brother-in-law, wrote memoirs. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich controversially declared himself the head of the imperial house in 1924, a claim disputed by other branches of the family and still contested by Romanov descendants today. The question of succession, of who speaks for the dynasty, has never been fully resolved, and it generates a level of internecine argument among Romanov descendants that would be almost comic if it were not also genuinely sad. What the Bolsheviks understood, and what they were trying to prevent, was the possibility of the Romanovs becoming a symbol around which opposition could rally. They failed in the long run. At that prevention, the Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion bearers in 2000, a category of sainthood in the Orthodox tradition reserved for those who accepted death with Christian humility rather than resistance. The canonization was controversial. Many historians and even some church figures pointed out that Nicholas was responsible for policies that caused enormous suffering: the 1905 massacre on Bloody Sunday, the failed management of the war, the repression of political opposition. Canonizing him risked confusing political victimhood with Christian virtue. But the Russian Orthodox Church made its decision, and today the site of the Ipatiev house, which was demolished by order of Boris Yeltsin in 1977 when he was the regional party secretary and apparently wanted the embarrassing landmark gone, is occupied by the Cathedral on the Blood, a large gleaming church built in the 2000s and dedicated to the royal martyrs. The long-term consequences of the Romanov collapse extend far beyond the fate of the family itself. The destruction of the dynasty removed the one institution that had provided symbolic continuity across Russian history since 1613. The Bolsheviks understood they needed to replace it with something equally powerful, and they did: the cult of Lenin, then Stalin, then the party itself. The Soviet state was, in many structural ways, a continuation of the autocratic tradition it claimed to have abolished. The concentration of power in a single leader, the suppression of dissent, the use of state violence as a governing tool. These were not Bolshevik inventions. They were Romanov inheritances, radicalized and modernized. The geography of the Romanov story also matters. Yekaterinburg sits in the Urals, on the border between European Russia and Siberia. It is symbolically a threshold. The Romanovs had used Siberia for a century and a half as a place of exile, a place where troublesome people were sent to disappear. It is a historical irony of almost literary precision that the dynasty ended there, in a basement at the edge of the empire they had built. The city itself has never quite escaped this history. Renamed Sverdlovsk during the Soviet period after Yakov Sverdlov, one of the men who authorized the execution, it reverted to Yekaterinburg after 1991. The city is now a major industrial and cultural center, home to about 1.5 million people, and it hosts a steady stream of pilgrims and tourists who come to visit the Cathedral on the Blood and the nearby Ganina Yama monastery, built on the site of the original mineshaft where the bodies were first disposed of. The question of what the Romanovs represent in contemporary Russia is genuinely complicated. Under Putin, there has been a deliberate rehabilitation of certain aspects of the imperial past, a kind of selective nostalgia that embraces the grandeur and the geopolitical reach of the empire while remaining uncomfortable with its failures and its end. The canonization of the royal family fits into this pattern. So does the increasing prominence of the Orthodox Church in Russian public life. But the Soviet past is also rehabilitated selectively. Stalin's wartime leadership is celebrated even as his terror is officially acknowledged. Russia is, in this sense, a country that has not yet decided what story to tell about itself, and the Romanovs sit at the exact center of that unresolved argument. The bones of the family were finally interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in July 1998, 80 years after the execution. Boris Yeltsin attended and gave a speech acknowledging the crime as one of the darkest pages in Russian history. The Russian Orthodox Church initially refused to participate, still uncertain about the DNA evidence and the canonical status of the remains. It was a ceremony marked by the same ambivalence that has surrounded the Romanovs ever since, too important to ignore, too complicated to fully absorb. There is one more thing worth saying. The Romanov story is often told as a tragedy of individuals, a gentle, devoted family destroyed by revolutionary violence. And that is true. Nicholas was by most accounts a loving father and a man of genuine personal piety. Alexandra was devoted to her children and consumed by the anguish of her son's illness. The children themselves were innocent of everything. Their deaths were a crime, and calling them that requires no political qualification. But the tragedy of individuals does not exhaust the meaning of the event. Nicholas was also a man who, in 1905, authorized troops to fire on peaceful petitioners outside the Winter Palace, killing hundreds. He was a man who resisted constitutional reform for years, who dismissed capable ministers and retained incompetent ones, who believed so completely in his sacred duty to preserve autocracy that he could not see the system destroying itself around him. The private Nicholas and the political Nicholas are both real, and the story of the Romanovs demands that we hold both in view simultaneously. What happened to the Romanovs after 1917 is, in the end, a story about what happens when power becomes sacred, when a dynasty confuses its own survival with the survival of the nation, and when the gap between the mythology of rule and the reality of governance becomes so vast that nothing can bridge it. The Romanovs had 3 centuries. They built cathedrals and empires and one of the most elaborate court cultures in European history. They produced reformers and reactionaries, visionaries and mediocrities, and they ended in a basement in Yekaterinburg, in July, in the dark, with the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke, while a civil war raged outside, and a new world, brutal, utopian, and equally convinced of its own sacred mission was being born. The question of whether Russia has ever truly reckoned with that night, with what it meant and what it made possible, is not a historical question. It is a present one.